So every child may look different, every disorder may be different from the other, but they're basically all the same problem. And that may sound confusing, but I will clear that up for you. Again, many people when they hear these statistics say, well, you know, it's just that we're recognizing it more. But a recent study by the Mind Institute out of California showed that when they looked at the California rates, that there had been a 600% to 700% increase in 10 years in the diagnosis of autism. They wanted to know why. Was it that we're diagnosing it earlier, doctors or pediatricians or schools are more familiar with it? Was it that we changed our diagnostic criteria in the 90s, which expanded it to include more children, which did happen? Was it that we were substituting children that used to be diagnosed with mental retardation now may be diagnosed with autism in some cases? Or was it perhaps that people were migrating into California because they gave better services? They looked at all those factors, and the bottom line was they found that it only could account for about 200% of the 600% to 700% increase. So in general, a lot of the studies that have been done looking at this show that maybe 25 to 50% of the increase could be explained by better recognition, better diagnosis, or expanded diagnostic criteria. But 50 to 75% of the cases we see now did not exist 10, 15, or 20 years ago, which means that it is increasing at an epidemic level. So the next question is why? Well, most parents are told that these problems are genetic. And by that, what most people think is that that means some sort of genetic mutation or something with DNA. But when we hear about genetic, what we have to do is we have to think about two things. One is there's DNA, meaning the actual makeup, the physical makeup of the gene and the way it's actually distributed. And then there's what we call transcription and translation, meaning how do we translate those instructions into what the person looks like or behaves like? And they can be very, very different. Bottom line is that after 25 years and 95% of the research dollars looking for the bad gene, we haven't found it yet. There are some suspicious genes, there are some genes that look a little unusual in some of these disorders, but any one of those genes that may in fact be an actual mutation is only found in about 1% of the population. So clearly, the majority of cases don't have these genetic mutations, but they do seem to run in families. And although at one point we used to say that autism and ADHD was highly inheritable, which means that if you looked at twin studies, and there's been about 20 twin studies done since the 70s till now, that it seemed like identical twins would have autism at 90% of the time, both would have it, and fraternal twins would have it maybe 15% of the time. So it seemed like, wow, then this must be genetic, right? But now a recent study out of Stanford that came out about 2 months ago, which was the largest twin study and the most extensive study that was ever done on 162 sets of twins with autism, showed the reverse. Showed that it was much more prevalent in fraternal twins than it was in identical twins, almost at a 2-to-1 ratio, so that they actually stated that the contribution to autism, that the environment played almost 60% of the role, and that the genetic component only made up about 38% of the factors that contributed to autism. So what we do know is there's no such thing as a genetic epidemic. All of this, what it means is that what actually seems to be happening is what we call epigenetics, which means that there may be certain personality traits or certain children that have a predisposing genetic makeup. But there's nothing wrong with their genes. But rather what happens is environmental influences that normally should be available to the child either are not there or are not able to get there to turn on genes that build what we call functional connections. And so the expression or the translation of these genes is altered without altering the DNA at all. So what that means is that we may be able to turn those genes back on. The whole point of this is that this epigenetic process, or what we call epimutations, versus true genetic DNA mutations, the difference is if it is truly genetic, from a mutation, we can't do anything about it. And maybe there are some cases or kids like kids with Fragile X or kids with Down syndrome that may have autistic features or may also have attention deficit problems or Tourette's or OCD. But that's different. Those are kids that truly have a genetic problem but do not necessarily have what we call autism or ADHD. But most of the kids that have the disorders, they don't clearly have anything wrong with their genes that we can see, but they have genes that just are not being turned on or turned off. The thing about epimutations is that a gene can be turned off in a parent, and what we do know is it can be passed on through multiple generations in a turned off position, so it can look like it runs in families or look like it can be genetic. And again, this was the cover of Time magazine last year, talking about this and talking about how, again, DNA is not your destiny, which means we can change these things. A true gene mutation we can't, but an epimutation we can. And I'm going to describe to you in a moment how these genes get turned on, and you're going to see that it's mostly environmental factors. So by changing or utilizing environmental factors, we can turn these genes back on and actually create an environment where we can get their brain to grow and develop the way it was always supposed to grow and develop in most cases. And it says here that the choices you make can affect your genes and those of your kids, which means that when we talk about environmental factors, it doesn't necessarily have to be, mercury or pesticides or some virus from outer space. It can be lifestyle changes. And I think all of us would agree that our lifestyle has changed dramatically over the past 20 or 25 years, mostly because of the use of technology and what it's done to our lifestyle, as well as our diet and things like that, and stress levels. These are all factors that play probably a more significant role than pesticides or infections, although they do play a role. Bottom line is that we can change these things. So the belief that, a lot of people will, from the very beginning, say, why are we even listening? Because they're genetic and there's nothing we can do about it. That's not true. That's not what the scientific research shows at this particular period of time. So what are brain balance centers and what are they all about? Well, we're not healthcare facilities, and even though we're talking about the brain, that throws people off sometimes because we're learning centers like Huntington or Sylvan or Kumon, but we only work with special ed type kids. We only work with kids with learning differences. Why? Because that's the fastest growing population of kids that there is right now, and because there is no other large organization that's completely committed to working with those kids and those families. So we're looking to fill that need. But what we do is we look at all of these disorders, despite what they're called and their labels, as ultimately learning disabilities or learning differences of one kind or the other. Some children have difficulty learning academic material and have difficulty learning in school. Other children have difficulty learning socially or emotionally or non-verbally. And those children have a learning disability as well, but it's not an academic disability, although it can impact their academics. Either way, they are learning disabilities, and so we use a learning center type of approach. But because they do involve the brain, and again, if I was to ask any one of you, when you learn something, where do you learn it? Almost everybody would say the brain, right? But when we hear about autism or ADHD or Tourette's or OCD, we think, oh, that's medical, that's scientific, that's brain. But when we think about a learning disability or a processing disorder, we think, oh, okay, that's education, but we don't think the brain in that case. Even though when we talk about an auditory processing deficit or a visual processing deficit, we're not talking about a hearing problem or a visual problem, we're talking about a brain processing problem. But in either case, we're dealing with the brain. So the fact is, anybody who's trying to address a learning disability of any kind and isn't talking about the brain as a primary focus is probably not really going to do what's necessary to really correct these problems. So they are learning disabilities, and what we do is we assess children and really identify their weaknesses. Now, these do involve many different areas of the brain, so it's not just about academics. Learning is not just about academics. So what we do is we assess the motor system, their motor coordination, which is actually the earliest way that children learn, to be able to move around the world and interact with their environment. They also need to be able to collect sensory information through their senses so that they can move and behave and act and interact appropriately with their environment, which is what turns on their genes, which is what ultimately builds their brain. We also know that the brain is housed in a body. And if a child has immune problems, or if they have digestive problems, or food sensitivities, or if they have toxins in their body, we need to address that. Otherwise, there's no way we can get this child to learn and get their brain to function the way it's supposed to. We also realize that there's some behavioral concerns and things, lifestyle management, that we may have to do as well. So all of these things are involved, and what we do is we assess these children to look at all of these factors, and then we put together an individualized curriculum based on that, looking to address the weaknesses in the areas of the brain. And all of this is focused on dealing with the primary problem. Now, whenever I start a lecture of any kind, and I lecture all over the world, I'm going to be in Amsterdam in 2 weeks, I'm going to be in San Francisco next week, and I'm lecturing at various medical conferences, and I teach professionals. I was just at a medical college teaching 200 different doctors and physicians, and I just worked with a bunch of behavioral specialists yesterday and occupational and physical therapists today. The first question I ask, and I'm going to ask this of you, if you read my book, you can't answer, okay? So otherwise, I require that you answer, otherwise I'm going to ask it again. So please participate. If I was to ask you to raise your hand if you feel that you could stand up and explain what is happening in the brain of a child with autism or ADHD or dyslexia, you know, theories that you've heard or what you're familiar with. How many people here feel that they could stand up and actually explain that clearly right now? Okay. You may be shy, so again, I want to make sure you're participating, and by not answering, you may have been participating. So what I'm going to say is, how many people clearly feel that you could not stand up and answer that question as far as what's happening in the brain of a child? Okay. Do you see that as a problem? Right? I mean, and when I go to any professional of any level, I get the same response, by the way. Just lectured to 200 doctors, I got the same response. Now, if you're going to try to address a problem or potentially help it or even fix it, it's a pretty good idea to know what you're trying to fix, don't you think? So what I'm going to do tonight is go through and I'm going to explain to you what that problem is. Because a lot of people will say, well, nobody knows, and that's not true. We have a very good idea. Absolutely, there are still a lot more questions than answers. But we have a very good idea of what's actually happening in the brain, and that's what I'm going to explain to you, because then from there you can see how, you know, you're in a better position to make a judgment on what may help your child, or a child that you know, or why they behave like they behave, okay? So the problem is known as a functional disconnection. I started researching this over 15 years ago, basically because I was always in neurology and rehabilitation, and I taught neurology, and I had a degree in neuroscience and neuropsychology, and so research was always of interest. The brain was always of interest, but mainly I got involved with children because I had a son that was diagnosed with ADHD, and many of his friends were diagnosed with ADHD in first grade, and I wanted to know what it was. And when I went around and asked people, everybody of every profession said, we don't know, nobody knows. So I started doing the research on my own, and then fortunately early on I hooked up with one of the top researchers in the world, a gentleman who's been my co-author and is the director of our lab named Jerry Leisman, who is the first person to actually identify a functional disconnection in the 70s. And so what we see is that all of these disorders, autism, ADHD, PDD, OCD, Tourette's, dyslexia, learning disabilities, processing disorders, Asperger's syndrome, oppositional defiant disorder, all of them now are believed to have a single underlying problem, which is this functional disconnection. Some researchers use other terms. A guy at the University of in Carnegie Mellon named Marcel Just calls it desynchronization and underconnectivity. In UCLA, a guy named Dan Geschwin calls it developmental disconnection. We have Uta Frith in Cambridge in England. She calls it weak central coherence. Paula Talal and her group studying dyslexia in Rutgers calls it temporal processing deficits. Essentially, it's all the same thing. That basically, there's an incoordination between large cortical networks in the brain, so they can't talk to one another the way that they're supposed to. And in children, they don't actually link up and synchronize with one another during development like they're supposed to. Now that may sound confusing, so let me explain it to you a little bit more in depth. As I said before, you know, the brain needs to be built. What does that mean? It means that when a child is born, they only have about 25% of their brain actually there. And really, none of their cortex is really formed at that point. It's basically, you know, they just kind of have a brain stem at that point. Now, in the womb, we are adding cells to the brain. But the brain doesn't grow that much, because if it did, we wouldn't get the head out. I mean, it's already pretty hard, right, ladies? So imagine if it was any bigger. So the genes that are going to build the brain, you know, have very clear instructions. Don't turn on when you're in the womb. So when you get out of the womb, now turn on and start building the brain. Now, how do they know when they're outside the womb? Well, because they're exposed to the environment, like light and sound and taste and temperature and touch and gravity and smells and interaction with people. And so once they come in interaction with the environment around them, the environment then stimulates those genes and turns them on. Now, the majority of the growth of the brain, we do not add cells after we're born, for the most part. What the growth of the brain really occurs, and we go in the next 3 years, the first 3 years of life, we go from 25% of the adult size of our brain to 90% of the adult size by the age of 3. So there's this massive growth spurt in the first couple of years. And this happens mainly because each cell gets larger, so each brain cell gets bigger and larger, more protein gets put into it, like building muscles, and it becomes more insulated with fat cells, and these fat cells will grow and insulate it so that both of those factors, the increased size and the insulation, increase the speed of conduction so that electrical signals and impulses can be sent out faster, because that's the way that the brain cells process information. So they get bigger and faster and more insulated, but the majority of growth of the brain is through what we call functional connections, that we literally, like growing roots on a plant, that we grow connections that will reach out to connect to their neighbor cells in the brain. And when they do, they then start to stimulate each other. And then they start to group together in groups. Eventually they reach out and they form these local short-range connections with their local neighbors. And as they all grow and they become faster, they're able to group more and more cells to work together at the same time. They group into little networks, and then what they do is then they get rid of a lot of those short-range connections, and then they reach out to other more distant areas of the brain, especially to the other side of the brain, and connect with the other side of the brain. And what we know is the two things that really make the human brain unique in its intelligence, first of all, is not genetics. You know, people say, well, why is the human brain, why are we so much more intelligent than any other animal? Well, it's not because of genetics. I mean, we share 85% of the same genes as mice, 99% at least of the same genes as chimpanzees. Some people say, well, we have bigger brains per body size than any other animal, but that's not true either. Other animals have bigger brains than us relative to their size. So what is it that makes it unique? What makes it unique is the fact that we have these very large and fast brain cells that are very interconnected, and we can coordinate huge numbers of them to work together at the same time. And it appears that as the brain becomes more interconnected and as it becomes more synchronized, so we can use more and more and more cells to work at the same time, we cross over a certain threshold where there's a huge leap in intelligence. That really is why we see children go at 2 years of age from speaking about 50 words to 3 years of age speaking about 1,500 words. There's this huge growth in intelligence at that point. So let me just explain that to you. Imagine if I had a 500-pound weight here, and we have all these people in the room, and I had each one of you individually come up and try to lift the weight. You're not going to be able to do it, right? So now I have I say, okay, now everybody come down here. And now you all grab the weight. And now if I said to you, okay, everybody lift it. And everybody tried to lift it whenever they felt like it, at a random time. Still wouldn't be able to lift it, right? But now I say, okay, everybody, on 3, I want you to lift. 1, 2, 3, everybody lifts, and now we lift it very easily, right? So now it's no problem. So it's not the numbers that count, it's how many we can organize to work together at the same moment of time. What brings that whole group together, work as one, is actually time, right? The fact that we all do it at the same time. This is the uniqueness of the human brain, that we can actually activate huge numbers of cells on both sides of the brain to work at the exact same moment of time. Within nanoseconds, they have to be able to fire. If they fire by themselves randomly, doesn't mean anything. The other thing that makes the human brain unique is that we have what we call a very lateralized brain. So what we have is, again, this shows the interconnections that develop in the brain as the child ages. And the fact that we end up with this very interconnected brain, so that all of these brain cells are connecting to one another. We have 100 billion brain cells that form anywhere from 10 to 15,000 connections. That's hundreds of trillions of connections in the brain. That's almost as much as our deficit, right? But not quite. And growing almost as fast all the time. So we have all these brain cells that are interconnected and coordinated together. The other thing that makes the human brain unique is that we have what's called an asymmetrical lateralized brain. The right side and the left side of the brain do very different things. Now, in the old days, in the 60s, because there was research done at that time, that's when it became popular to talk about the right brain and the left brain. And the right brain does this, and the left brain does that.